All right, don't mind that video. It's going to be redone, but I'm your left-wing host, Brittany, and this is your right-wing host, Todd. How are you, Todd?
Doing great, Brad. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm excited. All right, yeah, so we got an exciting debate for you guys tonight. I didn't realize how much hype there was for it, but apparently this is going to be a very good debate. So let's bring on our guest. Let's bring on back Infrared. How are you tonight?
Good, good. How are you?
Doing good. So, yeah, you want to introduce yourself, tell people where you lie on the political spectrum, and where people can find you.
Sure, I'm Haas from the Infrared Collective. We're a group of international Marxist-Leninists. Um, you can find our YouTube channel at the Infrared Show, the Infrared YouTube channel. You can find us at Twitch at twitch.tv/Infrared Show.
Okay, thank you. All right, and next it's Zoltanius. How are you tonight?
I'm doing good. You can call me Zolt for short, by the way.
That sounds good to me. So, yeah, you want to introduce yourself, tell people where you lie on the political spectrum and where people can find you.
Yeah, so I'm Zoltanis, and I do political content, and it's kind of diverse in what I talk about. They can find me on Odyssey, BitChute, YouTube under Zoltanis. I'm also on Telegram if people want to join my Telegram chat. On the political spectrum, I would say I'm a fascist, but I don't really identify as right-wing, so...
All right. So I do have both of their information, all their links in the description. So if you guys want to go check out their stuff, you can find it there. All right, so here's what we're going to do. Each person can give an opening statement, can be as little as 1 minute, no longer than 5 minutes, about the topic and your stance. After that, we'll open up the floor. After the debate is over, we'll go into the Q&A. You guys can tag politically provoked, who your question is addressed to. After the Q&A, we'll do closing statements and final thoughts. So I think let's get started with opening statements. But before we do that, for Zoltan, if you want to give a little backstory on your guys' history before you start the debate.
I mean, there's not much. It's just that some people, like other Carl, wanted me to have like a debate with Infrared because Carl says he doesn't understand fascism, but I don't really care a lot. I like a lot of the stuff that Infrared does when it comes to triggering bread tubers. It's just really just only started after I did like a live stream with Carl where we kind of like reacted to his video response to Vosh on socialism, which I do agree that Vosh doesn't understand socialism. I just had criticisms that were directed at the video, really.
All right. Okay, and then just as far as the rules, let's limit the interruptions and the personal attacks. I know things might get a little heated, but let's try to keep it to a minimum. So yeah, opening statements. Zoltan, you want to get started?
Sure. So like my main central argument is that praxis and implementations of Marxism have largely been a betrayal of its actual theory if we look at Marx, Engels, and Lenin, as well as having to go back on things that were said before coming to power to justify regimes, namely Stalin with his original rejection of socialism in one country, and the notion of commodity production can exist within socialism, which he rejected originally, which he later pushed for after formulating the SIOC alongside, I think the guy's name is Bukharin, to oust left-wing opposition. And implementation of Marxism has largely ended up closer to fascism, and I would say this as a fascist, because they've adopted corporatist doctrines to justify themselves, utilizing patriotism or nationalism to various degrees with conservatism to sustain themselves, which I just think that's practical if we look at real world implementations. And I largely think it's because Marxism is unrealistic, but I don't think a lot of Marxists, specifically Marxist Leninists, represent Marx, Engels, or Lenin correctly. That's the main foundation of my argument.
All right, Haas.
I suppose my stance would be to argue that there's a direct continuity between Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and various others that came after. And not only was there a discernible direct continuity, but that each one of these people reinvented the same essential insight in a new form.
Okay, so we can open up the floor now.
Okay, so I would say like a pretty good overview of what I'm bringing up here is like on Principles of Communism by Engels in 1847. And like I'm pretty sure you've read it, but like the main idea is that the proletariat cannot exist with the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie cannot exist without the proletariat. And if the proletariat still exists or commodity production, there cannot be socialism because it's still capitalist. And people can go through that if they want to, but the basic gist of what is there is that capitalism is rooted in production of commodities. And I do know that Marx's analysis on this is because of ideas of like division of labor. Would that be largely correct?
Well, firstly, I don't think there's any contention as to the contents of Principles of Communism, but I think you may have read into it some kind of definitive statement about scale in terms of time. I think there's maybe a misunderstanding that what Engels was actually saying is that upon the seizure of power, commodity production, as well as the class antagonism, would instantaneously disappear. But not only do we not find evidence of Engels saying this in Principles of Communism, we find direct evidence of Marx and Engels arguing the exact contrary, that socialism will not amount to an immediate dissolution of the prior form of society, but merely represents the proletariat's political seizure of power. Now, in the ultimate and final sense, it is true that the proletariat cannot coincide with the bourgeoisie, but the key word is in the ultimate and final sense. That doesn't mean that instantaneously the class antagonism disappears. It means that ultimately it does, or in Engels' words, the governance over people ceases to exist. Only the administration of things, in regards to the dissolution of the state, for example.
Yeah, I believe what you're talking about is what Marx called Staatwesen, which translates to state machinery. A lot of people try to attribute that a quote to Lenin. That's more of a mistranslation, but it basically means a state is a skeleton of its former self, where you just have labor vouchers and it's just simply monitoring production, which isn't the way that we actually would think of a state in the real sense of like a governing body. And I do know a lot of Marxist Leninists try to say like historical materialism because of the different progression of the production to reach socialism, because it still has social ends, is usually like I would say it's more of a cope, because Marx outright calls that a political program. And a political program is something that he would define as actually being inherently reactionary.
I'm not sure where you're coming from there, but I will say that Marx and Engels are very clear about the fact that the state will continue to exist. It will not simply be a skeleton of its former self. And you can even interpret Marx's view in the 18th Brumaire about that the state machinery will be smashed, not to mean that upon seizure of power, the proletariat will no longer be in possession of a state, but that it will build a new state from scratch. And this is precisely what happened in the historical experience. But Marx and Engels are very clear that the state will continue to persist, and that the manner of its dissolution, the so-called withering away, in no way contradicts, as Stalin pointed out, the strengthening of a proletarian or socialistic state. In fact, this view of Stalin's is perfectly dialectical. It's one that there is no reason to think Marx and Engels, according to their own view of what the dialectic was, would
So,
disagree with.
so I know, like in State and Revolution, Lenin basically makes like the distinction that socialism is a lower phase of communism, and even in this lower phase where he writes about it, it would have like the abolishment of things like commodity production, which isn't something that Stalin would ever get rid of. And even like in his early years, Stalin called commodity production the inherent characteristic to capitalist production because it's related to the value form. And this isn't like definitions; this is more like the characteristics of a system. His definitions are retarded. But what would you say to that?
There's no doubt that commodity production dissolves with the dissolution of capitalism. The question is, similar to the question of the state, what is the manner by which the commodity form undergoes, I like to say it like this, the development of its own dissolution? And historical experience shows that the commodity form does not instantaneously disappear upon the political seizure of power, but that in fact a new type of repetition of the commodity form, the socialistic commodity, takes its place. And the socialist commodity, as a matter of fact, corresponds to the dissolution of the commodity form itself. If you read Stalin's economic problems in the USSR and you read his works on the socialist commodity, it's very clear in what ways the socialist commodity undermines the commodity form. For instance, the socialist commodity, and therefore the socialist commodity form, is based on a determinate relationship between state, for example, enterprises and the state in general, and the kolkhozes, another form of ownership, which is not necessarily private ownership per se, but it's still not the same as state ownership. The way this differs from the commodity form under capitalism is that the commodity form under capitalism is how should I say, a blank check. It can be exchanged pretty much with anything, so long as this other thing can be measured under the same form. This is not true for the socialist commodity form. So here we see a direct example of the manner by which the commodity form undergoes the development of its dissolution.
Yeah, so like I'll get to my explanation of commodity form in a second, but I do know in Anti-Turing, this is more of a paraphrase quote from Engels. It says the proletariat seizes political power and turns the means of production in the first instance into state property, but in doing so, it thus abolishes itself as proletariat, abolishes all class distinctions and class antagonisms, and abolishes the state as state. You also have the Lenin speech at the All Russian Congress of Transport Workers, which I'm also paraphrasing in a quote or a smaller quote. Indeed, the reign of the workers and peasants will last forever. We should never have socialism, for it implies the abolition of classes, and as long as there are workers and peasants, there would be different classes and therefore no full socialism. You also have Lenin in Economics and Politics and Era of Dictatorship at the Proletariat, where it says socialism means abolition of classes. And it is important to address, so the state is withering away as far as there is no longer any capitalists and classes, and consequently no class can be suppressed. That's usually something people try to say that Lenin justifies like a bureaucratic state, but he refers to it in the same term that Marx uses, which is Statuisen, state function, which is a skeleton. And I would argue that there is no commodity production under socialism. In the critique of the Gotha program, within cooperative society based on common ownership of the means of production, the producers do not exchange their products, just as little does the labor employed on the products appear here as the value of these products. You have Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 3, where he talks about money, the circulation of commodities, and like I don't really feel it's super necessary to read all that, as it's basically quotes. I do have a lot of notes on this if people are interested. But even Stalin echoes much of this in the agrarian question, where he says introducing socialism means abolishing commodity production, abolishing the money system, raising capitalism to its foundation, and socializing all the means of production. The socialist revolutionaries, however, want to leave it all this intact and to socialize only the land, which is absolutely impossible. If commodity production remains intact, the land too will become a commodity and will come on the market any day. The socialism of the socialist revolutionaries would be blown to the sky. And he would actually contradict this later on when he would encourage small-scale private land plots, which accounted for a majority of agricultural production in the Soviet Union. Sorry, I was a little long right there.
Sorry, am I unmuted? Yeah. Well, there's a lot to unpack. I will say I'm somewhat confused, and I think there's a misunderstanding here. There is no doubt, again, to reiterate, there is no doubt that for Marx, Engels, and Lenin, socialism corresponds to the dissolution of the commodity form, and that the commodity form, in the ultimate sense, is not compatible with socialism. The question is when. That's the operative point. So when Engels says in Anti-Turing that the proletariat in seizing state power thus abolishes itself, or he doesn't use the word abolish actually, but dissolves itself in the state, he doesn't say that this happens instantaneously. Nowhere do Marx and Engels or Lenin say it happens instantaneously. They make it very clear that this is a gradual process that doesn't. None of this stuff disappears overnight. Furthermore, with regards to the critique of the Gotha program, I think here you're confusing minimal and maximal program. For Marx, the critique of the Gotha program involved clarifying what socialism or communism would mean in an ultimate and final sense, or in other words, in the sense of a maximal program. He wasn't laying down some kind of principle that in no way could commodities correspond to socialism. I mean, Marx himself understood socialism as a process, as a movement, not as an end goal or an ideal. But he did understand that this process has consequences, ultimate consequences for the transformation of society. Among those consequences being the dissolution of the commodity form and the state itself. But that doesn't mean that this happens instantaneously, or that just because a given socialistic society does not possess these characteristics, this means they're no longer socialist. The point is, in what direction is the socialist society changing? Is it changing in a direction, in this direction, for example? Now, especially confusing is when you bring up the point about the land question, because, first of all, the context is that Stalin is addressing the socialist revolutionaries' inability to address the state of industry, modern industry. And for Stalin, modern industry will be, or Stalin, Lenin, the Bolsheviks in general, will be nationalized by the state. In regards to the transformation of land into commodities, the operative point is that they become commodities that can be freely bought and sold and exchanged. So the presence of quote-unquote private plots is completely irrelevant, because those private plots could not be exchanged between peasants. The produce produced on them could be exchanged in some kind of way, but the land itself could not be. So I don't see what's actually relevant, or I don't see how Stalin would eventually come to contradict himself when he stated this. Stalin did never say that no kind of commodity whatsoever would exist in the early stages, or even in socialism itself. He specifically spoke of how decisive the socialization of land and industry was to socialism. Now, what that looks like does not mean complete nationalization of everything. But it also doesn't mean that land can be freely bought and sold as a commodity. This is why I refer to the significance of a socialist commodity form. It's not the same thing as the commodity form under capitalism. Under capitalism, the commodity form entails the free exchange of commodities as a blank check. This is not the socialist commodity form, because the range of exchange is narrowly restricted.
Okay, so what would you say? Would you say like money is necessary for value takes, like value form? Would you say that?
Certainly, yes.
Okay. I do know that, like in Volume 1, Chapter 3, in Capital, Marx says the division of labor is a necessary condition for the production of commodities, but it does not follow conversely that the production of commodities is a necessary condition for the division of labor. Only such products can be commodities with regard to each as a result of different kinds of labor, each being carried on independently for the amount of private industrialists. And he continues on with the seizing of the means of production by society. Production of commodities is done away with, and simultaneously the mastery of the product over the producer, anarchy, and social production is replaced systemic definite organization. And I do know that there's actually stuff from Lenin, which I do have in my document, where he basically says that that Russia is incapable of carrying out the socialist revolution, but what they wanted Russia to be was more something symbolic, or something that could actually help foster revolutions in Western countries, which were actually in a position to where they could have the socialist revolution. And this is, Joseph Stalin talks about that in the Foundations of Leninism. I don't really feel it's super necessary to quote it, but yeah, I just want to know what your opinion on that is then.
Well, in regards to the relevant passages you quoted in capital, again, I'm confused. I don't actually see the relevance whatsoever. Does Marx say when this would happen, or does he say that, or does he imply that this ultimately will be the case? Does he say that this happens instantaneously upon a political seizure of power? This is highly doubtful because, as we can see, both Marx and Engels say the exact contrary in other places. So it doesn't make sense to me to quote these passages from Capital as some kind of evidence that the USSR could not possibly be socialist because commodities existed. Commodities existed, but only insofar as they participated in the development of their own eventual dissolution. And this is the perfectly dialectical view that is 100% consistent with what we know about what Marx and Engels said on the matter. Now, in regards to Lenin's view about significance of the Russian Revolution, it's true that initially Lenin believed, and the other Bolsheviks believed, that the Russia would not be capable of establishing socialism on its own. But when it became clear that the revolution was not going to spread to Western Europe, Lenin posed the following question. I'm not saying this ad verbatim, so I'm paraphrasing it a little bit, but it's more or less along these lines. What if the fundamental foundations of civilization, and Lenin, when he speaks of civilization, he means modernization, modernity. What if the fundamental prerequisites of civilization can be built not following the European path, but in an entirely new way? What if we can build these from scratch? And this was the path that Lenin resolved to pursue. That's why Lenin would say things like communism is communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country. It became clear to the Bolsheviks the revolution was not going to spread to Western Europe, and that wasn't going to save them. So they elected to maintain fidelity, actually, to what originally distinguished the Bolshevik way from the very beginning with the splits from the Mensheviks and other trends, which was a recognition that the essence of Marxism, of revolution, of socialism, must be rediscovered anew and in accordance with the national circumstances unique and particular to Russia and the Russian Empire at large.
Okay, so like Stalin does say in Foundations of Leninism that for the final victory of socialism, for the organization of socialist production, the efforts of one country, particularly of a peasant country like Russia, are insufficient for the efforts of the proletarians of several advanced countries are required. You also have Farewell Letter to the Swiss Workers. Single-handed, the Russian proletariat cannot bring about the socialist revolution to a victorious conclusion, but it can give the Russian Revolution a mighty sweep that would create the most favorable conditions for a socialist revolution. It would, in a sense, start it. Then you have the era of the dictatorship of the proletariat by Lenin. Peasant farming continues to be petty commodity production. Here we have an extremely broad and very sound, deep-rooted basis for capitalism, a basis of which capitalism persists or arises anew in a bitter struggle against communism. And on state cooperation, indeed, the power of the state over all large-scale means of production, political power in the hands of the proletariat, the alliance of the proletariat with the many millions of small and very small peasants, the assured proletariat leadership of the peasantry, etc., is that not all that is necessary to build a complete socialist country out of cooperatives, out of a cooperative alone. So is this not at all necessary to build a complete socialist society? It is still not the building of a socialist society, but it is necessary and sufficient for it. So it does sound like it is like he's considering it like it's trying to go towards socialism, but it's not still socialism. You can say they're ideologically socialist, but they're in practice the historical economic system that was put in place is not socialism. And that there's many things that we can go through on this, but I do think it's necessary to ask this. If these things are like what was all the context that all these quotes are said then, if they're basically like out of date?
Sure, yeah,
In your
it's
view?
very simple actually. I think again we are coming back to the same and original problem that I brought up before. Um, the distinction you are drawing between the eventual and final consequences of socialism for society and socialism itself is an undialectical distinction. Socialism is not an end state. Socialism is a process. It's a process that does have final discernible consequences for society, but when those consequences are realized, no one knows. It could be 100 years, it could be 500 years, it could be 1,000 years. No one said anything about when it would alter, as you put it ad verbatim, or as you were quoting ad verbatim, the final and victorious conclusion. We have to be very careful here and recognize these operative words. They are not talking about something that happens instantaneously or overnight. It must be thought of as a process. And furthermore, I also noted that you brought up Lenin in the era of dictatorship of the proletariat, that capitalism is being reproduced through petty peasant farming in the countryside. That is not the point of contention. That was the whole point of the kolkhozes, which you quoted ad verbatim. Lenin fully endorsed as the very solution to this problem. So I don't actually see what we're talking about here. I don't see how these quotations you have mentioned, I don't see how these in some way negate the view that the USSR was socialist. Was it the final conclusion, the final possible conclusion socialism has for the Soviet Union or the world at large? No, of course not. But it's not a dialectical. It's not dialectical whatsoever to think in terms of final conclusions. You think in terms of processes, and you think in terms of orientations and developments. You don't think of end states that are begin and end somewhere in some kind of arbitrary way. That's why Marx himself said that communism for us is not an ideal to which reality will have to conform itself, but a real movement, the premises of which are now in existence. Marx understood communism as an objective force in reality. So for the USSR to be a socialist society doesn't mean that it's a society final who's for whom the final consequences of socialism are already realized. It means it's a socialist society. It's a society that is building socialism, that is itself socialist. It's in the process of the development of socialism. There's no end state or end goal here that we're talking about.
So I believe like the main problem here is that I would say it's largely ignoring what the historical actual economic policies that were put in place at the time in place and what the practices actually were. In I'm mostly aware that they understood that socialism and communism are basically interchangeable, and saying that you're having a political program where it's just addressing itself to historical necessity, that's just seems more it's like a coping process to say that we haven't done socialism or we're not going towards socialism. Because if we look at what the actual historical policies were, it's basically state socialism, which is interchangeable with state capitalism, which I would say are good systems. They're better than what we currently have. And there's all kinds of stuff, such as like in Kadar on you had there's like an Hungarian article where it talks about planned management socialism, where it basically encourages small scale petty bourgeois ownership of the means of production. You have the case of Poland when it was integrated with the Soviet economy, where by 1956 most of agriculture was privatized. And then you have the piece rate system in the Soviet Union. You still have commodity production. You still have the value form. The only socialist to try an attempt to abolish the value form was actually Pol Pot. And I don't even know if most Marxists want to stand him, even though I think he's a great guy. But yeah.
Well, there's a few things. First of all, I'm not sure what policy I'm not sure how I'm ignoring historical policies. I think everything I've said is perfectly consistent with an appreciation of those historical policies. It's
Well, I
perfectly
think
consistent.
that's a criticism
Please
you have
don't
to
interrupt me.
fascism.
There's plenty of times where I wanted to interrupt you and I held back, so I want you to hold back
Okay,
too.
sorry. I'll apologize.
It's perfectly consistent with what I said, that socialism will take different form according to different national conditions. There's no blueprint for socialism written somewhere. There's no one path to socialism that applies for all. Secondly, I'm very curious to know where any prominent Marxist speaks of the abolition of the commodity form, whether Marx, Engels, Lenin, or Stalin themselves. Abolition is a political measure that you take by the use of state power directly. This is a voluntaristic and undialectical view of how a mode of production changes. A mode of production doesn't change because a state legislates so by law or abolishes something. It happens through a gradual process of transformation. The material, it's not just instruments of production that constitute the material forces of production. The material relations of production are also material and not purely subjective and political. So those cannot be abolished. This idea that the value form is abolished is 100% an American falsification that has nothing to do with Marxism whatsoever. There's no abolition of the commodity form, just like there's no abolition of the state or even abolition of class. The word Marx uses often is Aufhebung. He doesn't use the word abolition. He uses the Hegelian term sublate. And sublate obviously doesn't mean abolition.
So in Anti der Ring, Frederick Engels says, again, with the seizing of the means of production by society, production of commodities is done away with, and simultaneously the mastery of the product over the producer. Anarchy in social production is replaced with systemic definite organization, which is state machinery, which Marx used the term Staatswesen, which is basically a skeleton of the former self of the state. And this is just broad institutions that all they do is monitor production. This is not a governing body in the way that we think of like an actual state as state. And that's really like the main point of contention, because like it seems like you just want to go out and say material conditions when the material conditions don't address what the historical implementation of the policies were. You use that same exact criticism with fascism when you talk about its exact economic policies, even though when we look at Mussolini's regime, sure, there was laissez-faire economics for like what, 5 years, and you had the implementation of the Rocco laws with Rossini, which you brought in state-owned trade unions, cooperatives, and then by 1932 you had the formalization of the corporate state. By that point, 75% of the economy was in state hands, owned by the state directly, or had state management. And then by 1943, with Niccolo Bombaci, which was the founder of the Italian Communist Party, you had 95% of the economy that was socialized with worker management. And that seems like it's more of a distraction from what the actual policies of what Marx, Lenin, and Engels were arguing in their actual literature, to basically say that socialism is just whatever I want it to be at this given place in time, so I can address to any pragmatic policy. And then you want to implement people that are incompatible with a Marxist worldview, such as Nick Land and Heidegger, which Heidegger, if you go through his black books, is completely in line with like Nazi doctrine. And this is something that's largely accepted by National Socialists themselves. And I would say this even as a fascist.
Okay, you done there? You done?
Yeah, I'm done there, big guy.
We have a lot. So I can see why you choose not to turn on your cam, because I think the audience will show that the person behind the computer is a broken record and not a human being. Oh, it's not a broken record. Well, I'm not sure. Yes. So it sounds like you're just trying to throw a lot of shit at the wall and see what's going to stick. You quoted Engels again for no reason, even though we already addressed that what that precisely looks like and when it actually happens was not addressed by Engels in that book. I don't know why you just quoted it again. Then you said a lot of things about fascism that I'm not sure are relevant to the conversation. And you then, well, we can change the topic to fascism, since you don't know anything about Marxism. We can talk about fascism. Then you brought up Nick Land and Heidegger and find it impossible that they could ever possibly be reconciled with Marxism, even though the precedent for them doing so in the 20th century probably outnumbers the amount of people who, or at least in the case of Heidegger, probably outnumbers the amount of people who have an appreciation for Heidegger in isolation. And as regards to Nick Land, it's already been established. I don't know how you measure this, but most of Nick Land's followers and the people who appreciate him are Marxists. So I don't even know why you're bringing up. It's very chaotic. You're bringing up a million topics, trying to pivot away from the fact that you don't know what you're talking about when it comes to Marx and Engels. We talk about the implementation of policies and the implementation of this contradicting what Marx and Engels said was, but you're interpreting Marx and Engels' words to be what the blueprint is, what the minimal program is going to be when the proletariat seizes political power. That wasn't what they were talking about. What they were talking about was more fundamentally the ultimate consequences socialism would have for society. When Engels says that the anarchy of production is replaced with definite organization, that commodities are done away with, nowhere does he say that this is in the form of a policy that is written by fiat upon the immediate seizure of political power. If he says that, please find a single quotation by Engels that suggests in a specific determinate and concrete context, Germany, France, England, that immediately upon seizing power, the proletariat is going to do this, this, and this policy that will correspond with that. That wasn't how Marx and Engels thought. It isn't what they said, and they said the exact opposite. Engels even said that the forms of private property will persist after the seizure of state power. It's funny that you call yourself a fascist, but the extent of your knowledge about Marxism doesn't go farther than ultra-leftist and infantile leftists and Trotskyists that were profusely already critiqued and excommunicated from Marxism by Marxist-Leninists, precisely on the grounds that they possessed an implicit affinity with fascism, an affinity that you seem to be here confirming. The connection, it seems, between left communism, Trotskyism, and fascism, you have confirmed yourself.
Still there? Is the sound gone for you too, or is he just not talking?
Yeah, no, I don't hear nothing.
Are you still there, Zoltan? I don't know if he's there. This is the problem with no camera, though. You don't know if somebody's there. I don't know if he's there or not. Oh, there he is. Are you talking or not? Because there you go. Well, hello. I don't know if you were talking or not, but we couldn't hear you.
Yeah, it's being really buggy. Sorry about that.
Okay.
I don't know why he did that. I did not hear anything that he said.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Okay, somebody just sent me a message. He said that I affirmed a connection between like left comms and Trotskyists, right?
That was a very minor point that I made in rebutting pretty much everything you said. I said that at the end as a kind of ironic cherry on top, but that in no way was the substance of my argument. Substance of my argument is that all you know how to do is repeat yourself and not address any of the ways I've already responded to the various passages and quotations you brought up for Engels, Marx, and Lenin. It doesn't seem to be, it seems like you've lost the plot and you're not actually following the course of argumentation as it's been taken.
Okay, so I would say that the literature is actually honest with what it says. And my view is that Trotskyists and left communists or left comms have a more correct application of what Marx actually said. I see Marxist-Leninist as partly contradiction, and the other part is mostly because I see them as closer to me as a fascist, and most people like Ernst Niekisch, Karl Otto Patel, which were the German National Bolsheviks, identified very closely with them, and so did I think his name was Krivakesky, which was a Russian National Bolshevik. He considered basically Bolshevism to be kind of like a radish. It's white on the inside, red on the outside. And my view is basically the same, as that Marxist-Leninists have more commonalities with somebody like me. And the historical process argument, I would say, like the historical progression of what happened under these Eastern countries ended up embracing a form of corporatism, which is state-owned trade unions, cooperatives, or worker councils that basically coordinate production and planning for social ends. And that's how I would broadly view it. And I think that Marx and Lenin and Engels are very upfront about what they actually meant in their literature. I just think they're wrong and they're largely outdated. And Marx actually has an incorrect understanding of socialism. I believe socialism is state socialism when it's done for social ends in society itself. And the dialectical process, I would say, is actually more applied to the state when it applies to broader antagonisms inside of it, and then synthesizes them into the state, and then uses them for social ends of its own self and planning, stuff like that. That's what I would broadly say. I don't really want to associate with Trotskyists or left-coms, though, because a lot of them, in my opinion, are just, well, lack of a better word, they look like incels, but also coomers. I don't really know what you call them, but they look weird.
Are you done, or I don't mean to interrupt you?
No, yeah, I'm done, dude.
Okay. Well, it's not that I consider left comms and Trotskyists and yourself to explicitly agree with one another, but you share the same fundamentally dogmatic, epistemic position in terms of your thinking and in terms of your view of the matter. I know Mussolini thought, for example, that Stalin was some kind of red fascist, and many people, many fascists took liberties, both now and in the past, with how they interpreted Marxism, Leninism, and the meaning of Marxism, Leninism. But the plain-faced truth is that this is a form of copium to deny the simplicity of the manner by which Marxism, Leninism genuinely inherited the tradition of Marxism. From the very beginning of Marx's break with the young Hegelians, from the very beginning of Lenin's break with the Second International, Marxism has stayed in the middle course, the correct and golden, if you will, the golden mean, the golden course. And it has not strayed from this, either to the left or to the right. It has stayed on course and has maintained its consistency and its continuity with Marxism as a whole. There's no need to take liberties in calling it some kind of fascism or deviation, because, as we can see, so long as we are not dogmatic and so long as we are not undialectical in the manner by which we interpret the words of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, we can find very simply that Stalin, Mao, and others were in continuity with them. And the only proof of this we really need is that the same arguments you're using against Marxist-Leninists were curiously levied against Lenin himself. Lenin was accused of deviating from in Stalin's word, the Talmudistic doctrine of so-called doctrine of Marxism. Lenin was accused of deviating from Marxism and being a transgressor, but the truth is that what we're dealing with is a dialectic of essence and appearance. The stagnant appearance of Marxism would eventually come to contradict its actual essence. Lenin rediscovered the essence of Marxism, and in doing so broke with the official apparent forms of Marxism, the Second International. And it is not without this break that Lenin would have, that the October Revolution was even possible. And it's the same in regards to Marx's relationship even with, for example, German idealism. And you can go forward. I mean, this one-sided view that you're attempting to portray Marxism-Leninism under is the same view that left communists and Trotskyists had. And the reason why Marxist-Leninists historically associated I'm talking about in the 1930s, Trotskyism with fascism isn't because they explicitly agreed with one another. It's because they belong to the same historical one-sided position of this abstract negation of the classical liberal order. Marxism-Leninism, meanwhile, was not the passion of a one-sided negation, but involved the negation of the negation, the building of a new order in its place, a new reawakening of civilization, if you will. The things that fascists were saying superficially and apparently, for example, about reviving tradition, reviving civilization, and overcoming liberalism. Sure, they said all of these things, and they were very vain and passionate about saying them, but they didn't actually do any of those things. It's only Marxists and Marxist-Leninists in particular who, in reality, did this, and they did this which was perfectly consistent with Marxism from the very beginning.
Yeah. So like, my main view with like Marxism Leninism isn't that it's necessarily a bad thing that it wants to do like state capitalism or like state socialism, they're both the same, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think they're very positive ends for social planning and organizing the economy for society, and that's part of the reason why I personally don't get along with like Trotskyists or left comms. And you may be right that I may have like a similar criticism, but that's because I believe that the actual literature says different than what the was put into practice under Stalin. In fact, like part I know that like Stalin's main argument against Lenin was because of the NEP, but this is probably kind of odd for you. I personally think Khrushchev is better than Stalin's. He actually streamlined production, nationalized a lot of stuff, and people unfairly associate him with the liberalization of the USSR, which isn't accurate at all. It's but that's a different conversation on itself, really. And as far as like fascism, like saying it's going to like do a new order and all these different things, I would say like if you go through like academics like A. James Graeger, Roger Griffin, Zeev Sternheld, a lot of them do see it as a revolutionary political doctrine that did a lot of what it said in practice, including like the by Weber's book Varieties of Fascism. And usually like the more left wing cope against fascism is like the capitalism and decay thing that comes from Arpum Dalt. But Arpum Dalt's main criticisms against fascism, which they're in 10 points, anybody can look them up. Those same points on what he defines as like the capitalistic nature of fascism. Otto Ruhl, which was a Trotskyist from Germany, used that to basically umbrella fascists with Marxist Leninists too. Ironically, many of the same criticisms. People can find that on the RPLEM website if they're interested. As far as tradition goes, I don't necessarily care about tradition. Like Nazis were a bit more about tradition. I don't really care about tradition at all. Like I'm okay if people want to go destroy churches or religion. I don't really care. For me, I just want a society that's based on concepts of modernity and technology and adopting these to social ends. And I don't really see tradition as doing that. Mostly as it's old, sterile, and it's mostly liberal nowadays.
Okay, well, I have no doubt that you believe that your caricature of Marxism-Leninism is positive, that you just unironically identify with it. But I'm not interested in the caricature of Marxism-Leninism either that's been created by left communists, Trotskyists, and opponents of Marxism-Leninism at large. Whether they unironically agree with it or condemn it or not, I'm interested in the authentic essence of what Marxism-Leninism actually was historically and in the contemporary era. And if Marxist-Leninists have never transgressed, in terms of the main thinkers of Marxism-Leninism, they have never transgressed beyond the simple means of their words. People have to superimpose interpretations that these are red fascists, that these are grave diggers of the revolution, that these are bourgeois, state capitalist deviations, whatever. They have to superimpose this interpretation because they take too many liberties in terms of how they interpret the meaning of their words. Their meaning of the words of the Marxist, Leninist theorists and thinkers are indeed simple, right? They're very simple, but they're precisely simple because of the depth and complexity and brilliance that culminates into them. Now, in regards to the NEP, this was not the primary. I'm not even familiar with Stalin disagreeing with Lenin per se on the question of the NEP. Stalin affirmed, at least later, the necessity of the NEP. He just recognized that it had fulfilled its purpose by 1928, that its purpose was completed. The primary difference between Lenin and Stalin actually rested upon the national question, things like the Georgian affair. And here it's a little bit more complicated. Now, and it's a very subtle difference, not too much of a extreme difference. Now, in regards to this new order of fascism you allege, I'm not so sure what new civilization or reawakening of the fundamental civilization fascism was ever able to accomplish. If by new order you mean the invasion of Libya, Ethiopia, and Eastern Europe, through turbocharging the pre-fascist military-industrial complex with the backing of international finance and banking cartels, sure, but I don't see what's so new about that whatsoever. It seems to me, from a cursory glance at the actual history, that fascists were merely the hired thugs of international banks and the military-industrial complex and the status quo that had prevailed before they seized power. The Soviet Union, by contrast, never engaged in such vain transgressions of attempting to acquire some kind of colonial glory. All of the Soviet Union's actions, including the invasion of Finland during the Winter War, were done in accordance with its rightful historical and territorial rights, bounded by prior written agreements. The Soviet Union did not transgress the treaties it signed. It didn't in vain invade these countries it has no right to. So I don't see the Soviet Union rather focused on the reawakening of its own internal civilization.
Yeah, I would say there's a book by, I think his name is Stanley Turner, Hitler, a biography. Then you also have The Myth of Big Business in Nazi Germany. I don't remember the name of the author, but it's whatever. You have Mussolini's Intellectuals by Ian James Gregor. Then you have Fascism, just titled Fascism by Roger Griffin, which is another academic. All of them pretty much do a pretty good job going against the accusation of international finance backing them. In fact, the only people who say like back to the Nazis that had like an economic incentive were white Russians, I believe is what is pointed out in the biography on Hitler. I am aware of a book called Liberalism to Fascism, Industrialism During Fascist Italy. And there's actually a letter that's included in the book that is written to Gramsci. I can post an image of it in the Discord and on my Telegram if people are interested. But wait a second.
Did you get a phone call? Does he keep going?
Sorry about that. Yeah. I completely forgot where I was at, but
we're gonna probably get into the Q&A because we have a lot of them, and that could probably take up about
all right,
to an hour. So I don't know if you want to finish up some of your points, and then we'll
okay. Yeah. I forgot what I was saying on the last part, but basically those academics do a pretty good job going against the idea of international finance backing them. Instead, they show that there was a pretty big contention with international finance in them. And the letter that was written to Gramsci, it basically says that the industrialists were willing to pay the communists in Italy to disrupt the fascist unions organizations, which is pretty much an accusation that's leveled at fascists for doing against communists, which I won't necessarily deny, but Lenin did similar things when he basically disrupted union organization. And Varieties of Fascism, which is by another academic that I like, he basically says, upon closer examination, we find that most of the points which Dutt considers characteristics of fascism apply equally to communism. Distrust of parliamentary liberal democracy. Power was centralized to the party organs. The Central Committee and Politburo in the early phase of the Civil War. Lenin overturned the 1917 Russian Constitutional Assembly election forcibly after the Bolsheviks did not win the majority. Extension of state monopolies and state organizations, state planning, cooperatives controlled all aspects of the economy, the limitation and repression of independent working class movements. This was seen even during the Civil War with the crushing of, I think it's the Kronstadt Rebellion and the Ukrainian anarchists, the decentralization of all blocks into a single economic political unit, and the exacerbation of imperialist antagonisms both within and outside the communist world. Comecon was established by Stalin as as a binding economic force between socialist states of Eastern Europe and later the Warsaw Pact to hold onto these vast territories. As far as more antagonisms, I can think of China and the Soviet split, where China was basically engaging in all kinds of border skirmishes against Russia, unjustifiably so, and also many different Asian territories, and even worked with Pol Pot, who was funded by the CIA, and basically you could argue in forms of territorial disputes with other countries. And I don't necessarily think these are caricatures of what Marxist-Leninism is. I think they put up a front of Marx, Engels, and Lenin to justify themselves, but largely I see Stalinists as engaging in a form of revisionism to actually warp it to what they want it to be. And this is part of the criticisms, I believe, that Dugin has on one of his speeches on the failure of National Bolshevism, and one of the reasons why he disassociated from Edward Litmanov. That's all my points, but yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't want to take up too much time. It seems like you're trying to bring up a multitude of topics at rapid fire as though we're supposed to passively accept this without a careful evaluation and scrutiny of all of the different types of things you're saying. Because you said quite a lot of things just there. You made allegations you denied, for example, the connection between British finance and the British Empire and fascism. You then shifted to talk about you then pointed out that there were several apparent similarities between communism and fascism, none of which you have proven or persuaded anyone, in my view, into that these are the essential characteristics of either, respectively. They can even be applied to capitalist countries, to the New Deal America, for example. You then talked about how China unjustly engaged with border skirmishes against the Soviet Union. Again, well, that's your subjective view. In the Chinese view, all of the territories that were stolen from it in the 19th century, during the century of humiliation, are its own rightful territories. Now, you can disagree with that, but it's a legitimate historical claim and doesn't come from thin air like Ethiopia's invasion of Ethiopia and Libya, and moreover the Nazis' invasion of Eastern Europe, which was completely baseless and was based in no real legitimate historical claim, but they just pulled it out of their ass, basically. And then what else did you say? You said something about Pol Pot. I'm not sure why you want to talk about Pol Pot. The reasons for the Chinese supporting the Khmer Rouge are complicated, but they have to do with Vietnam and the perceived bullying that Vietnam was engaging in the region. It's an old history, but it's a border dispute. It has nothing to do with the kind of vain adventurism of fascism whatsoever. There's nothing comparable to that in the history of communism, not even the invasion of Afghanistan, which was by far the most controversial in the communistic world. Then you say that Marxist-Leninists put up a front of real continuity, but they twist everything only in order to fulfill what they want it to be. But you haven't actually engaged with the content of what Marxist-Leninists want. It hasn't occurred to you that what Marxist-Leninists want is, in fact, to maintain fidelity with that original brilliance and that original revolutionary insight that began with Marx. That is what Marxist-Leninists ultimately, so far as theory is concerned, want. Anyway, should I continue or?
He's back. Hold on. And it says the device isn't connected though, Zoltan. I don't know what you just did. I can't pull you in if you don't fix whatever it is. He's below there. I don't know if we should just hop right into the Q&A. Or you can keep going. He can probably hear you, but I don't know what's going on with his. Oh wait, there he is again. No, it's not working. I don't know what you're doing. It's not working though, whatever it is. I don't know. Maybe we should just hop into the Q&A and let him figure this out.
Sure. I guess as a concluding remark, I'll just say that, as far as I'm concerned, that Marxism is not, as Stalin pointed out, Marxism-Leninism, by extension, is not a dead letter. It's not a dead substance, and it's not a dead collection of texts. Marxism is a living essence, and it doesn't exist to conform to some kind of I guess Talmudistic textualism or textual purity. It exists to relate to the material world in a specific way, the reasons for which relate to something much more fundamental about the encounter humanity has with modernity as a whole. So that's what I'll say.